No, but you can have Okay, so good morning, everyone. I'm Edith Gut. We met last time in Gdańsk. I'm a doctoral researcher at the Polish Academy of Sciences, and I'm thrilled to be here today and to moderate this amazing discussion. We're going to talk about this democracy in the Czech Republic after the recent elections. We're trying to zoom into the institutional and the social preconditions about what change might happen in the country, in the broader region after the elections, whether should we be optimistic about the change, and we are going to reflect upon different pressure points. And we have an excellent panel with two very distinguished guests. One of them is Jerome Harto. I hope I'm not butchering his name. He's the director of this fantastic institution. Thank you for hosting us. And Pat Kutilek, who is a politician, a local politician from the Green Party in Czech Republic, and a political scientist and a guest lecturer at different universities and platforms. I'm sorry if I'm not listing them all. So welcome, gentlemen. And so as you might have all read in the news, this was specifically interesting election in Central and Eastern Europe. It was depicted in the news as a giant success to combat illiberalism, authoritarian populist trends, Euroscepticism even. And what I would like to talk to you about today, whether we can interpret it as a change for a good, how it's going to translate into policymaking, and whether we can talk about, I don't know, the return of the king or something, which is about a good type of change when it comes to regional calamities, because I'm really reflecting upon like the media interpretation about what was happening here. And I would like to give you the floor to give some introductory remarks for about like 7-10 minutes each. And I would like to start with you, Pat, please, if you could take
with me. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Well, thank you. First of all, thank you for inviting me. And many thanks to the organizers, and many thanks to Czechia for hosting us. Well, when I first saw the headline of the panel today, so whether or not the Czech Republic is actually a more resilient democracy, perhaps in Central Europe than the other Visegrad 4 countries. It made me think about, why is it that we may appear, and why is it that we as a country, in fact, may be a somewhat more resilient democracy. And I would sort of give three answers to that, which would partially explain, partially support this hypothesis, let's say, but also offer a few words of caution, because I think we are sort of caught in the moment, or some of us are caught in the moment, perhaps, that the big evil populist is gone, and suddenly paradise on earth is going to erupt, and that's certainly not the case. So I'll get to that towards the end of my introduction, but yeah, I would, as a political analyst, perhaps, if I were to say why is it that, compared to Hungary and Poland and Slovakia, perhaps the Czech Republic is a slightly more hopeful case. The explanation would be, I think, well, twofold or threefold. One of them would be sort of the cultural factors in this society. The other would be institutional factors in how the Czech constitutional system is set up, as opposed to the other Visegrad countries. And the third one would be really sort of, a bit of caution, saying, well, partly it's luck and partly it's sort of really the temporary impression that we may have. So first of all, on the cultural factors, I would actually say that it's, I think, quite significant that actually the Czech national myth about sort of what makes a modern Czech nation is largely or partly built, as opposed to, I suppose, the Hungarian experience of this, the suffering after Trianon, and the Polish national myth of struggle with Russia. I guess I'm simplifying. I'll be happy to hear your perspective. But I think in the Czech case, the Czechs, data shows this from polls. What Czechs tend to see as sort of the most defining and certainly most proud moment in Czech history actually was the First Republic, the interwar republic between the wars, which was and generally is credited, and certainly in the Czech national psyche, it is seen as one of the few functioning democracies in Central Europe at that point, or in Europe at that point, and it is something that actually a significant part of the Czech population actually is proud of. I think it was a CVVM poll 2 or 3 years ago, which actually showed that over 70% of the Czech population actually sees as the best time in the Czech history. Even if we sort of look at it today with the 32, 33 almost years of democracy in this country, and we look at sort of this golden age in most people's psyches, which actually lasted for just 20 years, really. So it was a relatively short experience. This was a moment that actually Czechs see as sort of as the pinnacle of Czech history, and something that actually, we spoke about the morning panel spoke about the November Revolution. This was in a way the November Revolution was sort of going back to. The aspiration was sort of to go back to the partly to go back to the status quo, ante-status quo, the status before the communist regime. So it was a restoration in a way of a democratic tradition. The sideline to that, which is actually sort of not part of the official Czech myth, is that actually Czechs did have back then the lack of actually sort of learning progressively, if not democracy, then at least parliamentarism under Austria-Hungary already. And the Austrian side of the Austro-Hungarian Empire actually did have a limited but sort of progressively expanding parliamentary system. So actually the Czechs had learned some basics of actually how political parties work and how they represent different interests. And then sort of this, which actually culminated in the First Republic, which itself is part of the national myth, detached sort of from the Austro-Hungarian experience. But the Austro-Hungarian experience is still there. Then there's, of course, different bits of the Czech national myth, which I guess we'll touch on more later, which actually I think may explain to some extent the huge, the high proportion of Euroscepticism in this country. But I guess we'll get back to it later. I'm now focusing on the nice facets of the apparent resiliency of the Czech democratic system. So first is culture. Institutionally, and this I think has a little bit to do with also the First Republic experience, was actually the way that the Czech constitution is designed. We have one feature, my argument would be one feature that actually differentiates the Czech constitutional system from the V4 countries, which is actually we are the only country with a fairly functioning second chamber, upper chamber of the parliament. Hungary and Slovakia do not have one, as you may know. Poland, to my understanding, has a much weaker Senate. In a way, it is similar to the Senate as it existed during the First Republic in the Czechoslovak case, in that it is in the Czechoslovak case it was elected. In the Polish case, at this point is elected in a way that actually basically makes it nearly identical in its composition to the lower chamber, and therefore it makes it basically a rubber stamp chamber. While in the Czech case, the Senate has, although it is institutionally weak, with a couple of exceptions that I'll mention, it is constructed partly intentionally, partly by luck and coincidence in 1992 when the constitution was being written. It's constructed very differently from the lower chamber, which indeed is normally, as in most parliamentary democracies, the key point of the democratic system and the power chamber, really. But the Senate actually has a few. First of all, the way it is elected with a different electoral system on completely different dates, so it actually represents a different sentiment than the lower house. It tends to be, for much of its history, and not just over the past 6 to 8 years of Babiš in power, to put it simply, it tends to be an opposition chamber. people tend to use the election for the Senate to elect, to support parties which are currently in the opposition. And this has been true since the Senate was constructed in the 1990s. This is why it has always been a major source of frustration for whoever was the strongest party at that point, whether it was the conservative ODS or the Social Democrats or later Babish's ANO. They would always fare badly in the election, and people, the voters would actually support typically centrist parties, or typically parties that actually were in either centrist parties or parties that actually would be in opposition against the executive power, basically. And so this is a significant institutional feature. And the Senate, as I mentioned, actually is actually fairly weak. It can sort of delay regular legislation, but it's crucially important in two different things. First of all, as you would expect, you cannot change the constitution without the Senate. You need a 3/5 majority in both chambers of the parliament. So, you know, Mr. Orbán couldn't do what he did in Hungary in this country. And actually, well, there's a few more key features, like actually the Senate confirms nominees for the Constitutional Court. So actually, and if we had more time, I'll actually say the Constitutional Court actually is also a functioning Constitutional Court. Is actually also a reasonably well-functioning Constitutional Court with some qualifications. Is another key feature of the Czech system, as opposed to Hungary and Poland, perhaps, and Slovakia to some extent. The other bit, which is especially, I think, forgotten actually, and there's a special provision in the Constitution. One specific type of law you cannot change without the Senate's consent is electoral law. So actually, you cannot change electoral law without the Senate consent. Even if this is not actually constitutional law, you don't need the supermajority, the 3/5 supermajority, but you do need a simple majority in the Senate at least to actually pass electoral laws of any type. So you cannot actually remove local democracy. You cannot remove or change electoral laws on any level in this country, which sort of, I would say, is a very underappreciated but significant feature of actually the Czech constitutional setup. So yeah, culturally and institutionally, I would say these will be the two most important factors that came to my mind when I saw the name of the panel. And the third bit would be, you know, very briefly, just as I said, rather I guess a word of caution. You know, we are not really out of the deep water in this country. Mr. Babiš and his party were defeated in this past election, but it's important to say that, well, two words of caution. First of all, not all the parties in the nascent governing coalition are pro-European. They are, in a broad sense, pro-Western, perhaps. But the lead party in the coalition is going to be the conservative ODS, which is has very significant Eurosceptic strains. Their key motto was "We belong to the West." That was sort of the key motto on the posters. But the West, basically, in the case of the ODS, means belonging to NATO, let's say, and belonging to the West economically, but not really being too enthusiastic about more profound European integration, certainly. And the other smaller parties in the coalition at this point, I haven't had a chance to actually read the full government platform that's going to be presented in the parliament yet. It was published a couple of days ago. But generally, the commentary that I've seen is actually that the smaller, more liberal or more progressive and more pro-European parties haven't really been able to put much of the agenda into the joint platform. Significantly, for example, this government is very likely not going to make any steps towards the adoption of the euro, for example.
This is very important. I would like to get back to that.
So just to wrap it up, really, the cultural and institutional features of the Czech society and Czech political system sort of help it make a bit more resilient. But you know, the the struggle continues, I would say. And
So cautious optimism, that would be the main, so to say, the conclusion of the introductory remarks. Thank you. It was very important that you reflected upon the institutional safeguards. This is exactly what is missing right now in Hungary, as you mentioned, because there are technically no democratic institutions that could constrain the executive power. In Poland, it's still a bit like in the middle, I would say. We can maybe hear more from Jerome, but before we go there, I would like to ask you to give your introductory remarks and specifically reflecting upon the social preconditions. Like, is the Czech society showing some sort of resilience towards authoritarianism? What can we read from the electoral results?
Yeah, thank you very much, and thank you for your introductory speech. And I partly agree and I partly disagree, but I am more cautious about the idea that Czech Republic would be a resilient democracy in some Europe. I don't know if we are observing the return of the king here. So first of all, I would like to thank the organizers for their invitation and also thank them to bringing us together to CEFRES. I've been honored to be the head of CEFRES for 3 years now. So I am indeed speaking from Prague, but I'm not a chair, even less, I'm not a specialist of Czech Republic. I practice political sociology politique, of regime changes and process of democratization. And my expertise cover post-communist countries and especially Poland, because it's on Poland that I have worked for years, and my PhD was on Polish politics after 1999. And also, I'm working on Maghreb, especially on Tunisia, where I spent 4 years as an observer of the transformations after the so-called Arab Spring. So no doubt these different experiences in Poland, in the Maghreb, can help me to appreciate the idea that there would be a singularity of the Czech trajectory. So I would respond also by stressing three points. First of all, I would maybe just want to say that, of course, the Czech situation and Czech history since 1999 has its own particularities. I am, of course, thinking of the speed and the pacifism of the so-called Velvet Revolution. I'm sure you all know that. Even I think most of you were not born at that time, but it was a pacific and very quick revolution, which was after some of the others, especially in Poland and Hungary. Also, I can quote the non-violent divorce between Czech Republic and Slovakia, which is not obvious. I mean, and it was extremely appreciated from abroad, because how can you separate two parts of the same country so easily in a way compared to other situations? And I can quote also the economic reconstruction of the country after decades of a planned economy. And I'm also thinking more recently of its acquired status of a reliable partner of other European countries, especially in the framework of European Union. I think it's something also very important. The Czech Republic has quite good relations to Germany, with which it has been reconciled despite painful memories of the past, and also with France, which with it has, for example, signed a strategic partnership agreement some years ago. You may know that there is a military cooperation in the Sahel between France and different countries, and only with Czech Republic in this region. And that augurs a quite close cooperation between the two countries in the context of the successive presidency of the Council of EU next year in 2022. That said, I think these elements are not enough to build the picture of a stabilized political system or a resilient or consolidated democracy, as some transitologists, some careless transitologists used to say in the 90s, maybe you remember that. So I think there are several reasons for this. So I would say three main reasons. First series of reasons relates to the evolution of its internal politics. First of all, like other countries in the zone, in the Visegrad countries, the Visegrad region, Czech Republic has experimented a profound transformation, recomposition of its political life since at least 2012, with the unexpected score of the ANO movement from Andrzej Babiš in 2012, a trend which has been confirmed in the 2017 elections, where it obtained almost 30% of the votes. So we were witnessing the emergence of new political forces, replacing the older political parties, and it's not specific to Czech Republic. We've seen that in Poland maybe before, because PiS, PO were created in 21, so it's maybe more. There's a difference in terms of time, if you want, but Czech Republic also knows this kind of transformation. The other evolution, and this is far from unique to the Czech Republic, is the tendency of the left to disappear from political representation. So in the 90s, there was this Czech exception because there was this Communist Party from Bohemia and Moravia, which was a kind of anachronism if we compare to Hungary or Poland or Slovakia. But now, this party now is outside the parliament. In 2017, the Czech Social Democratic Party, which is the other, let's so call it the left leftist party, got only 7% of the vote, and also the Communist Party. And in 2021, for the last elections, these two parties are swept away because they couldn't obtain at least 5% of the votes. So they were deprived of seats for the first time since 1999. I think it's a very, very important also turning point in terms of exclusion of one part of the political spectrum from the official representation. Of course, we know that they maybe pay for their participation, for the Social Democrats, or for their support without participation, for the communists, to the Babiš government. But this exclusion of the left is historic. And even in Poland, Poland is well known as ultra-dominated by right-wing parties. The left has resisted, and the SED, for instance, the Alliance of Democratic Left, is still in the parliament with 12% in 2019 elections. In Slovakia, despite huge corruption scandals, the left is still in the parliament. So from this point of view, Czech Republic is not so wealthy in terms of broad representation of different political ideas. Another argument is that this indicates a profound transformation of political cleavages and party cleavages. And almost everywhere in Central Europe, the left-right divides, or as in Poland, the cleavage between the ex-communist and the ex-Solidarity members have been gradually been replaced by a cleavage which would be between, let's call them the Republicans or the Democrats, depending on which country we talk about, and the other ones. So some people like the term populist. I don't, because I think every single political party is populist in a way, even the moderate ones. So let's divide those. Let's say that there is a cleavage between the Republicans or Democrats and the radicals. Of course, these radicals have different identities, depending on time and space, of course. But this new cleavage is maybe not a very good also news for democracy, because what is the difference between public policies presented by Babiš government and by the current coalition in Czech Republic? There are not so many differences in terms of in economic terms, in social terms. So I would say that this tendency, which is not specific to Central Europe, because in France there's the same kind of tendencies going on, is absolutely we have to admit that. I think it's not really a very good signals. And this leads also to bargaining between parties which don't have so much in common. And Babiš was leading the country with a socialist. Now we have Spolu, which is dominated by ODS in Czech Republic, and they ally with pirates, which in terms of, I think, political culture are quite different, so they create this kind of strange majority alliances, which I think doesn't give a very good signal. And let's go even further. In the last elections in Czech Republic, the victory of the opposition is, in French, en trompe-l'œil, is apparent more than real. Why? Because the radical camp, in terms of vote, is still dominant. If we count the votes, the Democrats represent only 2,333,000 votes. And the opposite camp, if we include ANO SPD, which is the far-right party, and their allies, reach 2,637,000 voters. And there is, and I agree with you, an institutional effect, because there is this, I never know how to say it in English, threshold.
Threshold, yes.
Yeah, I cannot pronounce it. Le seuil d'accès to the parliament, which is about 5% for single parties in Czech Republic, the same in Poland, for your information. And that's why some parties was excluded from seats. But in fact, the numbers of voters who were voting for, let's say, the radical camp or the radical camps is more than the others. And if the threshold had been had been 3% and not 5%, Babiš certainly would be the current prime minister in Czech Republic again. So this is also an important, I think, to say. Everything here has a consequence on the position towards the EU. So as you said before, and I'm sure we will come back to that later, but if we observe speeches from Andrzej Babiš, if we observe the persistence of parties clearly hostile to the EU, and also in the, let's say, democratic camp dominated by the ODS, and you reminded that before, ODS has a very complex history with the idea of European Union, and we shouldn't forget the experience of the former leader of ODS, Václav Klaus. He was prime minister, he was also president of the country, and he was a strong Eurosceptic of EU. And as you said, inside the ODS, there is still this idea going on. This was my first point, but the two others are much smaller. The second one,
sorry, we cannot go that into within the introductory remarks. Can we get back to it when we're in the discussion?
Yeah, of course.
We would need to move on. So, okay, just wrap it up, please. Okay.
It's not really
okay.
Understandable. If you don't mind, it will be very short. The second set of reasons relates to the comparison with other countries of the region. I just want to say that as an observer of Polish politics since a lot of time, I would say that the favorable democratic image of Czech Republic appears above all in contrast to the radicalism of Poland and Hungary. And maybe we will come back later. It's my opinion, but of course, maybe you don't agree. And third reasons is to do with the more general observation of democratization processes, not only in Czech Republic or in Visegrad countries. And as you probably know, because maybe most of you are students, there was a very important paper in 2002 from Tomáš Karoters in the Journal for Democracy. Karoters was an observer of democratization processes all over the world after 1999, and he has shown that in different countries there were two different processes going on. Some democracies, some new democracies became unfeckless pluralism states, where in fact there was so much pluralism and the institutions were so weak that there was a mess and there was no stability. And the other evolution was dominant power politics, I mean, when someone strong takes the power, and these two trends we can observe different kind of them in many countries of the world. And it just an appeal to be extremely cautious when adopting simplified concepts to analyze a living experience, which I think is still bringing a lot of surprises. So thank you very much.
Okay, you get 2 times more time than Pat has, so let's let's give him some space. Thank you very much. Very interesting from the point of view of a systemic party structure and a historical point of view. Let me get back a little bit to the actual pressure points of systemic problems in Czech Republic, and I think it's very important to zoom into a little bit of corruption, systemic corruption here, because compared to Hungary, for instance, where illiberalism is centered around one strongman, like a one party headed by a strongman, in Czech Republic, it's completely different. It's I think it's like more decentralized, and it's centered around super strong corporates and external actors when it comes to systemic corruption and clientelism. I'm very curious what you think, Petr, about what sort of strategy should the new government use in order to combat systemic corruption, especially that in this environment, we not only have domestic actors, but also external Chinese, Russian influence as well.
Well, thank you. That's a really fascinating question. And I'm by the itching to respond to some of Jerome's points, with whom I actually agree much more than I disagree. But there will be a few comments that I'll make maybe a little later. I will answer your question actually. I guess by mentioning a few things. One of them would be that when we speak of sort of corporate influence on Czech politics, I always try to caution listeners that the term corporate, it may invite the understanding of these actually sort of multinational corporations. What we actually talk about really are private firms, local financial groups, and such that I think are much more of a problem. Mr. Babiš and his political economic conglomerate, I would say, is one example that is very widely understood. That I suppose most of you who have looked at Czech politics over the past almost a decade, and some of the conflicts that it has had with the European Commission, this has been sort of much about Mr. Babiš's abuse of political power for his own interests, and basically the conflict of interest that he had as somebody who effectively still controlled actually a significant agricultural and chemical company in this country. But importantly, there are actually other sort of powerful actors, which are basically closed financial groups of super rich individuals. Just outside here, Penta, another one, originally Slovak or / Czechoslovak financial group, is basically building up half of Prague. And this is sort of a closely held partnership of 5 people, I think. And so there has been this problem, both with actual outsized influence, I would say, of specific business interests, and perceived corruption stemming from that, I guess. Which so tying it quickly, I guess, partly was one of the reasons the perceived level of corruption in this country was one of the reasons behind the rise of the populist politicians 10 years ago, I would say, or 8 to 10 years ago. And so Mr. Babiš quite absurdly actually rode this wave of understanding that there's actually a lot of corruption going on around Czech politics. And yeah, I would say that actually I think it is especially at this point for the ODS to a big task to show that they are not really tied to and controlled by these very specific powerful financial groups in this country. PPF would be actually one of the other financial groups that we haven't mentioned here yet, but you spoke of the Chinese and Russian influence in Czech politics, and PPF has been recently actually exposed about a year or two ago by Deník and one of the more recent sort of liberal dailies in this country, as effectively having had a huge impact on the shift in Czech foreign policy through President Zeman and through the Social Democratic controlled foreign ministry, but also through its ties to the ODS previously. They had very good relations with both parties and with Mr. Klaus, by the way, as well, whom Jérôme mentioned. So they actually, over the past decade, have managed to weaken what was during the 1989 revolution, the clear drive towards the reintegration, as the Czechs imagined it, with the West. And actually, these very specific interests, PPF being a financial company, financial group active in the loan business, very much, I think about 30 to 40% of their business actually being in China at one point. And so actually they were the ones who were actually under pressure by the Chinese government to actually try to get favors from the Czech government and to change the course of the Czech foreign policy, which has been under President Havel very much not only pro-Western, but actually also very much critical of human rights abuses in China, for example. So I don't know if I'm answering your question, but I guess I would say that these strong business interests are still there. There, I think, over the past couple of years, both in case of Mr. Babiš and in case of the PPF, for example, they have been under increasing scrutiny, which I think is a good thing, or which I guess will argue is a good thing. And I'm hopeful that the public pressure on the ODS and on some other actors will continue to show that their influence will not be increasing. We'll put it that way, diplomatically, I guess.
Thank you. It brings me to the issue of media capture, and I'm turning to Jérôme now, because I think it's strictly related with what you just mentioned, that the influence that Andrej Babiš still has throughout his companies, and that he still can grab power throughout media capture, and he's owning, like maybe not a majority, but a significant amount of media platforms in this country. And Jérôme, I would be curious to hear, what do you think? What sort of impact it has on the quality of democracy combined with this systemic pressure of corruption?
Maybe if I may, I would like to add one or two words Please. To what have been said by Peter. Yeah, there is maybe two paradoxes here to share with the audience. The first one is that I'm sure we remember one of the conditions that have been defined for the entering of these countries in Central Europe in the EU, were to show that they were fighting against corruption. And I remember that Romania and Bulgaria had to wait for 2 years more, among other things, because they were not giving enough signals that they were fighting against corruption, I remember. And the paradox is that 20 years later, we are still talking about corruption and the effects on democracy, which is something that is a bit, curious. I don't have any answer to that, but I think it's something that we have to think about. The second paradox is the fact that in many countries, especially in Poland, for instance, emerging parties, the so-called populist parties, emerge with a speech, with a strategy against corruption of the others. For instance, Prawo i Sprawiedliwość in Poland, PiS, Platforma Obywatelska, which is not considered as a populist party, but a new party emerging in 2001, were extremely successful because they were using this anti-corruption speech, and they were focusing against the SLD, so the post-communists, who had a lot of affairs, scandals at that time. And in Czech Republic, it's the kind of contrary, because Ano, who can be considered as this radical party anti-system, at least at the beginning, he's actually the corrupted party, or his leader is corrupted. And this is something I think quite quite important also to think about, because this appears as a singularity as well. And when what you say about media, we all know that not only in Czech Republic, the same in France now with the emergence of CNews. It was the same in the United States, of course. The close connection between political leaders, entrepreneurs, becoming political entrepreneurs, and media are the worst situation we can expect, because they don't respect the pluralism, and they don't respect also the contradiction, and they also attack the mainstream media all the time. It's the case of CNews in France. It's the case of now the national TV in Poland, which you should watch the national TV in Poland just to understand what's going on now. And I think, of course, it has major effects on the population. But maybe you will have more to say about the current TV system in Czech Republic than me.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned this, because I think what generally, obviously, the media landscape is changing, right? With the way we consume, and most people consume the media through social media and through sort of decentralized platforms. It is sort of becoming a mess. One thing that I was going to mention, but I didn't originally for lack of time, was actually perhaps one thing that differentiates the Czech case from Poland and Hungary is that actually we have a better functioning public TV broadcaster. Public TV broadcasters in general. I think that the radio, although when you listen to their programming, you do hear certain shifts here and there, but they are, and in this case, I don't really have a strong answer for actually why that is, because institutionally they're actually quite, let's say, under threat, at least, or at risk of political influence as well. But they have maintained, I suppose, through internal editorial processes, a higher degree of autonomy, I suppose, than the Polish TV. I actually haven't looked at the. I remember that was 10 years ago. I was looking at the Polish the public TV's governing structure, but I haven't actually in recent years. It's changed significantly. But yeah, you could say actually the Czech TV technically is the public TV. The public TV is actually potentially vulnerable also to political influence. And yeah, I think that they've been very careful to sort of walk the line between their independence and sort of, at least in their main programming, in their main news bulletins, not to go against the government too forcefully in a way. So yeah, that would be the, and just a very quick comment. And if you sort of look at the two big public broadcasters among TV, they again are basically controlled by the some of the significant financial groups that we mentioned here, and you do see a trend of actually them using it for the political influence as well. So we're not really, in that case, we're not really much doing that much better. I would say perhaps, yeah, there was interesting that you made the point that this is sort of becoming a global trend as well, and has become a global trend, which is, yeah, I was going to sort of touch upon the cleavages in politics that we see today between, let's say, liberalism and call it, and sort of the nativist, anti-democratic system that you see, and how that's going to play out. I think it's sort of a challenge that we all face throughout Europe in a way. Some systems are more resilient than others, but I think it's becoming a new joint challenge for all of us. Yeah, sorry.
So maybe one thing to add what you said about the, so to say, the resilience of the public media structure here. It could actually have a lot to do with what you said previously about the resilience of the institutional framework per se, because In Hungary, why it was so easy, like a smooth sailing for Viktor Orban to capture the media from the very beginning. By the way, I'm a former journalist, so I was watching it from within. I was working for the state television at the time. Is that there were, no external constraints. The media authority, all the institutions were just opening it up and let it go. They didn't really do anything against it. And this is how it became a top-down, centralized, over-politicized system by today. And majority of the media landscape has been captured.
However, if I just touch upon that quickly, how are the boards actually structured? So I guess my question at you would be, because in the Czech case, the Czech Public TV and Czech Public Radio, their governing boards are actually appointed by the lower house of parliament. So actually, it's actually fairly open to pressure. And I think, my answer of actually why perhaps the TV and the radio to a lesser extent are resilient would actually be the internal morale of the.
So exactly, this is the key, because in Hungary it is the parliament with 2/3 majority which is deciding upon who is going to sit on these boards. And most importantly, right now before the elections, the head of one of this most important media authority, she just signaled she's going to deliberately resign before the elections so that this parliament, before Orban might lose the elections, might be able to choose another person for 9 more years, which means if there's going to be a shift in power, she's going to be still, someone, or he's going to be someone elected by this parliament by Fidesz, meaning that it's going to be the ball game that they would like to get for themselves.
Maybe I can add something, because I don't know exactly the institutional differences in terms of appointing the peace boards. I would suggest that there is a kind of standardization of that. So I'm not so convinced that the idea that there is resilient institution. I would more agree with what you said at the beginning when you said that maybe as you said the national pride, this kind of element. I would suggest, I'm not sure, of course, but as an hypothesis to understand the differences, that in Czech Republic, there's no illiberalism in terms of Hungarian or Polish strategies by PiS or Fidesz, but I think it's possible. But the difference is that maybe there is less, Babis, for instance, is less ideological than Kaczynski or Orban, partly because they use the history as a tool in the political competition, and because it reflects to people. People are convinced by that. Also because they have, especially in Poland, a social policy very strong. But probably there's not the same ideological commitment. So maybe they don't need to use the media, the national media, to go to reach their goal. So maybe this is the difference, but I'm pretty sure that if there is this kind of leader emerging in Czech society, if he wants and if he convinces people to vote for him, and if he has a majority in the lower chamber, I think he will succeed in manipulating the media. I think I'm not sure the institutions are enough, independent and institutionally strong to borrow that. But
I think this distinguished feature is very important, and it's going to bring us to the whole impact on the Visegrad cooperation and illiberalism in the region. But before that, I really wanted to talk a little bit about the external environment, the European Union, because we wanted to get back to that. So what do you think, Pat? Are we going to see a bigger convergence between the Czech Republic and the EU on important issues like, social issues, green transition, more importantly, and this is your field of expertise, or security, like burning issues which are on the agenda of the EU nowadays?
Well, now that you added security, I guess I'd be a bit more positive on that one. But my short answer to the first part of the question would be no. So I don't think well, with a side note, there's one thing that's actually happening at this point, and Jérôme mentioned the Pirates potentially becoming part of this coalition. It's not a done deal yet. They're actually over the Pirates having sort of a strong participatory internal culture. they are actually now voting on the text of the coalition agreement. So all party members are taking a vote over this weekend, basically until I think Monday, and it's far from a done deal that they will actually join in the end the coalition. They would be sort of, I guess, the most progressive, and to some extent at this point that they are set up, and this hasn't always been true because the party started sort of as a anti-system party of the millennials a decade ago, and they were very much reminiscent, I guess, to the old Western European Greens, and actually they were sort of critical of many institutions, critical of the US, for example, as well. They have changed significantly, and their nominee for the foreign minister, for example, is a staunch pro-European and a staunch pro-Atlanticist at the same time. Not a typical pirate that you would imagine 10 years ago, who would be sort of anti-system, anti-US. But it's not sure that actually the pirates will actually join the coalition yet. In any case, even if they do join, they will not be the strongest voice in the government that I mentioned. Then it's going to be the ODS, and the ODS has been quite consistently fairly Eurosceptic. And as I mentioned, they were instrumental to making sure that there's no mention of joining the euro. Although all the other four parties, the Triple Nine, the Christian Democrats, the Stan movement, and the Pirates were in favor of actually joining the euro, or making steps towards joining the euro, for example. The ODS actually blocked that as the strongest party in government. Similarly, you mentioned sort of green transition and Green Deal. That's a favorite punching bag also for many ODS politicians. And so you can sort of see the, as Jérôme mentioned as well, this really being traditionally the party of Václav Klaus, who was sort of the most vocal Eurosceptic in this country for a decade or two. And this sort of tradition there remains. I mean, I do have some, not too many, one or two friends in the ODS who are actually more progressive and pro-European. And I see some people on Twitter who are sort of the young wave of ODS members, but they're clearly a minority in the party. And as long as there's an ODS prime minister, and as long as the ODS has some influence, for example, on the EU presidency, which seems likely at this point, this is going to remain a fairly, well, first of all, in the Czech context, a fairly Eurosceptic government, which is not going to be taking any further steps towards EU integration, especially the euro being both factually the most important point, and in terms of sort of political mobilization being the one issue that people fight about, and certainly not making any sort of further steps towards European federalism, perhaps. And so this would be I'd be very skeptical actually that this government would make any steps in that direction, which has to do sort of very quickly. There's an interplay between sort of the political leadership being Eurosceptic and the population being fairly Eurosceptic, which we can sort of get back to later. And this government certainly will not do anything against the Eurosceptic part of the population.
I can't help but make one follow-up question. This is elephant in the room, the rule of law in the Europe, especially in Central and Eastern Europe. Part of the coalition is sitting together with Polish PIS in the parliament, in European, like the conservatives and reformists. I was just wondering, what do you think? I mean, are there going to be any change? Are they going to reflect upon issues of rule of law deterioration in Poland and Hungary, or are they just simply not going to call their neighbors of this kind of violations at all?
The question on me? Or
it's actually a question to both of you, because now we're shifting towards the Visegrad context.
If you want to answer. A very quick question. A very quick answer would be, again, rather not. I think, again, because you do have at this point within the ODS, and it's a fascinating sort of bunch of people to watch in a way, because some of them have gone from being sort of strong Atlanticists and sort of conservatives of a Reagan-like style, which we may not like or agree, but we can sort of respect them roughly as liberal Democrats towards people who and I can think of Alexander Vondra as one example, who is basically at this point soft Trumpian and certainly a fan of peace and certainly apologizing to some extent, at least even Viktor Orban. And so actually you do have these strains within the ODS which are not only Eurosceptic but are actually sympathetic towards the well, ideologically and in terms of sort of power allegiance towards peace and Orban.
Thank you. Jerome, anything to add?
Just a word about what you said just before and now, and it's only a reflection I wanted to share about how politics, how to say that, how cooperation or bargaining between different countries work when it comes to concrete European issues. And sometimes it's really very different than the speeches. Like Emmanuel Macron, for instance, doing a speech and saying that there is a gap between the liberals, but in the same time trying to find some partners to reach some specific goals in terms of in the European context. And for instance, I think about the strategy low carbon, which is a very big issue. I don't know if you heard about that. And if you sometimes talk about that when you have a coffee, if you talk about the strategy low carbon, but it's one of the main issues that diplomats and negotiators think about every morning when they go to the bathroom. It's really something very important for them. And there's also the security cooperation, especially in the Sahel. And we know that Czech Republic is quite committed in that. So for instance, for a country like France, now the question is, what will be the next government? And they hope that they won't be too green because France is a nuclear power, and Emmanuel Macron has just said publicly that he would build a new nuclear
reactors.
Reactors.
And Czechia has a strong ally in that and will remain certainly, because even the pirates, which sort of have this sort of that's what I was saying. They're not green. They're a very interesting party analytically and interesting. And to me, if I weren't green, I'd be, I guess, most sympathetic to the pirates.
Yeah.
But they're not green. It's a very different sort of. They're in a way fairly well grounded in the Czech experience, which at the same time, I think this explains one thing as we haven't actually touched upon. I guess Czechs, tend to be, and some of them at least who reflect upon it, tend to pride themselves in sort of being fairly a technological and technocratic country. And so I guess it sort of explains, first of all, I guess it explains a slightly different shade of Babiš's populism from Kaczynski and from Orban, together with, I guess, what I was mentioning at the beginning, was the Czechs also are, a fairly, I guess, one of the most secular societies in Europe, as opposed to the proud Christian traditions of Poland and even Hungary. Though I think Orban has sort of played that up, right, in a way. Czechs are much more sort of, and it's partly in the culture and partly sort of played up, of course, by politicians, sort of the pragmatic, technological to even technocratic nation. And so, first of all, a huge amount of the Czech, a huge proportion of the Czech population, as opposed to Western populations, loves nuclear or likes nuclear, let's say, or is not critical towards nuclear energy. And so this country actually has been constructing, and there's now a debate whether or not to construct a new nuclear reactor. The one thing that has happened, basically, that in the end, apparently the majority of certainly this coalition has agreed on, that there's going to be a strict, for geopolitical reasons, a strict exclusion of Chinese and Russian companies. But generally, I think that this government will go on in a plan to actually keep building a new nuclear power plant. And has been, the Czech Republic has been working with France to actually get that into the EU strategy actually to recognize nuclear energy as a key tool towards achieving carbon neutrality. So as you mentioned, the allegiances sometimes are interesting and surprising.
Yeah, because what we expect from this past election, if we are all Democrats and progressive, we would expect a victory, for instance, of the more progressive parties in Czech Republic, like the Greens, for instance. But our own governments from the western part of Europe who fight against illiberalism and radicalism, in fact, they prefer someone like Babiš than anti-nuclear leader at the head of the government. And I think this contrast, or this it's not a paradox, but this reality, this double reality is very important also to have in mind.
So before we open up the floor for questions, I have one last question. If you could just give a very sharp and brief answer to that, what should be the main lesson learned for those future united oppositions or already united oppositions in Central and Eastern Europe that are willing to speak up and stand up against authoritarianism when it comes to strategy, ingredients for success, and I don't know, whatever you think important. And I'm specifically thinking about a Hungarian opposition, which is about just united and try to beat big problem.
Right. Well, if I can start quickly, I think you sort of took it out of my mouth a little bit. But yeah, I think the lesson here was the cooperation. I think in this respect, actually, I was critical of my own party's leadership, and actually we didn't find as a party a way to actually participate in one of the opposition blocs. In this case, really, the two opposition blocs managed to get the trust of the people in there actually, and it was interesting to see that actually the electorate quickly changed allegiance from the Pirate/Stan coalition towards the more conservative Spolu movement as soon as it appeared that actually they are the ones who can actually beat Babiš. I think that was sort of the winner, the bandwagon benefit of the party that because early in the spring it seemed actually that the Pirates with the Stan, the Mayors and Independence movement, their coalition is going to beat Babiš. And then when they started weakening and the Spolu started going up, you could see a quick shift actually, Spolu becoming the strongest challenger very quickly, the allegiances of the electorate switching. I know the Hungarian situation is a bit different because of the electoral system and because of the situation overall in Hungary. The opposition is building basically one bloc. I understand that.
Yes, and it's a lot more tilted playing field as well.
That will be right. They will be trying to beat Orbán. So yeah, the answer I guess was cooperation and creativity in that. And yeah, I think to some extent, I'm saying it as a Green who are in this country certainly seen as an extremist party, but I think it's sort of being able to sort of overcome your ideological differences and pet issues and pet identities, and being able to build something else and to take actually in a way. If I were to be a political consultant, I would say something that Jérôme had mentioned, that there is actually in a way a realignment in the societies, I think, which is sort of manifested in the new cleavages. To really think about sort of whether there's a left-right struggle in the country going on, whether it's sort of the progressive versus conservative, or liberal versus conservative, being the main cleavage, or what is actually the conflict around which you're going to build and challenge the authoritarian, and actually how to quickly, how to cleverly take away some of the authoritarians' strongest points. A word of caution in the Czech case, as Jérôme mentioned correctly, and I think as I mentioned a little bit at the beginning, or in our private discussion, it was also luck and a feature of the electoral system that part of the populist vote, if you put it simply, fell through, and the more pro-democratic countries pro-democratic parties managed to get a majority in the parliament. Hope they don't screw up, let me put it that way, because there's a huge challenge now before them over the next 4 years to actually preserve the key institutional features of a democracy and if I were to say a word of optimism, finally, for me as a green, or I guess for anyone else, is that generally, I hope this opens a space for finally a political debate in this country again on sort of on issues. So we don't actually
Policy issues.
on policy issues, right? So we don't actually just spend sleepless nights whether or not this country is going to have a functioning democracy in 6 months, but we actually can start actually debating policy issues
And governing.
And yes,
Yeah, that's important. So what do you think, Jérôme? Can we say that this kind of new cleavages that you just mentioned are technically right now between the pro-democratic, anti-populist, pro and against something which have been we witnessing in a couple of years here in Czech Republic, and those who have been in power for years?
I'm afraid yes. I'm afraid yes. And again, not only there, it's the same in our Western countries. And that has a very, very bad effect on depoliticization of people in terms of content of the policies. So you can, of course, mobilize for democracy against authoritarianism. But when it comes to talk about what social state we want, or the limits of the social state, what kind of globalization we want, what economic system we want, then there's no debate. And I think it has a worse effect in the end, because in fact, it's not a real politicization, it's more a depoliticization of people. And I think it's the worst thing. I think we have to defend education, promote education and consciousness of the past, but also to keep an eye open to the present. I gave you an example. This morning and this weekend, I'm attending the World Uyghur Congress. I don't know if you heard about that. It's in Prague. So there are a lot of representatives from different countries, Uyghurs, but also people from US and elsewhere who support Uyghur issue. And there was, for instance, a speech this morning by one of the representatives of the Senate. As you said, Senate, Czech Senate is an important institution, who made a speech and said something which was quite touching. He said that he comes from the country of Kafka and Havel. And these two creators, writers, wrote a lot about the absurdity of bureaucratic system. In Kafka's novel, or in Havel's theater, we could add also, of course, Kundera and some other writers. And he said, we as Czech people, we know what it means to be in the hand of a totalitarian regime, as Uyghurs are now the victims of China. So he tried to refer on the struggles of the past, to observe the present conflicts and the issues like genocide or crimes going on in the world. And I think as a new generation, and our generation, of course, is the same, we have to be aware of the past and open our eyes to the present and be without any concession. And the problem is that there is a kind of fatigue, because there are so many problems everywhere. In Central Europe, the problem of rule of law in Poland and Hungary especially, but not only, but especially in these two countries, covers many aspects. One of them is academic freedom, for instance. And we as academics, being in the academic institution, we are trying to be aware of that. So we are organizing conferences, for instance, in 2 weeks, there will be a big conference on academic freedom in this region and elsewhere. But there is a general apathy or indifference to this kind of topic, because it's not taken seriously by a lot of people in the society. So there is a big issue there. We need, as a European, I don't know if I'm a federalist, not a federalist, but I am a European, and I'm so much aware of things down in our names. The Belarus case, the Ukrainian invasion by Russia, the drama in the Mediterranean Sea, for instance, 50,000 people were killed in our names, in the names of, in name of our security. 50,000 people were killed in the Mediterranean Sea because they tried to cross it and nobody went to rescue them. So how can we do that without, paying attention, being conscious? And now there is a cultural genocide being done in China, and our representatives have so many economic ties and connections with China that it's almost impossible to fight against China. And the senator I was talking about is Pavel Fischer. Is quite involved in this issue. And I remember last year, the Czech Republic was the actor of a scandal, international scandal, because there was a meeting with Taiwanese representative and representative of the government, I think yes,
of the Senate, actually.
Of the senator, yeah. But it was considered abroad as, and it's a sign of courage. And I think, we maybe one of the solution would be to be courageous.
Yeah, and not to get always carried away by the historical shadow of the past. I mean, you brilliantly located one of the most important regional calamity in Central and Eastern Europe. Let me quote my favorite political thinker, István Bibó. He said that in this region, everything is being dominated by the undigested historical trauma of the past. Communism, Habsburg Empire, Turkish, whatever, everything. And this is how Polish and Hungarian axis could develop this very strong anti-imperialist sentiment while talking about Euroscepticism and speaking up against Brussels as the new empire of Moscow and Habsburg monarchy and stuff. So, but exactly, and what you're missing here, I think what you said that it's missing is the focus on the policy issues and governance at the end of the day. And I think like the proof of the pudding is eating it. So let's see how the new united opposition becoming a government is going to function. And at this stage, I would like to open the floor for the questions before we wrap it up. Let's see, 1, 2, let's start here. Please introduce yourself for the benefit of the speakers.
My name is Anna and I'm coming from Poland, originally from Russia. So my question, first of all, thanks a lot for this eye-opening presentation and insight into the current political issues in all the Visegrad countries. My question is about Euroscepticism that you mentioned at the beginning. So actually it's just out of curiosity, is it a result of public opinion polls or decided by the support of more Eurosceptical political parties? Because I think it's a bit different. Also in case of Poland, we can see that people really support this, like if we ask people if this is public opinion polls, there is high support for the EU, but the picture from the political point of view is a bit different. And the second question is about migration and where do we place migration in this discourse, especially with in case of the Czech Republic, because with Poland and Hungary, we often hear that they are very skeptical and a negative attitude to migrants, but where do we place this issue in case of the Czech Republic?
So yeah, so if it's a question for me, I can answer that. Okay. The first part, Euroscepticism in this country, I think is it's partly a function of the history and the national myth that we have. Czechs have well, to some extent, sort of absurd traditions of sort of, have I heard of the Hasidic movement in the medieval times? So this was basically, and this is something actually you can sort of see if we do have an old historical part of the national myth is sort of the Czechs going against the rest of Europe, and this is something that was sort of for others it was basically an early Protestant movement, although they didn't consider themselves Protestants in the 14th century, right? I'm sorry, 15th century, and they were, and this was something that sort of has been used and abused by different political leaders ever since. It's also one of the explanations actually why the Czech society today is a bit more secular, because of the religious struggle going on for centuries afterwards in practical people's lives. But it also, I guess, explains the secularism and explains sort of the sort of feeling that the Czechs are somewhat different than the rest of Europe. I guess the other important thing that I would sort of pick from the Czech political experience would be I mentioned Trianon in the case of Hungary. In the Czech case, it's Munich and the betrayal by the West supposedly in 1938. So there's a significant strain in the Czech population that sort of has this skepticism about what the actual what Western powers, well, France to some extent, Germany certainly, want from us, and they want to, and Britain has a very specific place in the Czech national psyche, I would say. But the third point of explanation I would have about the sources of Czech Euroscepticism, and that I think is a bit more already related to current politics. So yeah, first of all, it is sort of different political actors using and abusing these sort of historical moments in ideology. You can sort of hear it, especially from the far right. But sometimes you see people from the ODS playing up a little bit with the Munich card, for example. Even that, sadly. But the third point I would say actually is what I already mentioned. I guess I think this is related to the sort of Czech secularist and sort of pragmatic and practical approach to life, is sort of the transactional understanding of well, first of all, politics in general, I think, and even belonging to the EU. Generally, I think what I would actually say is partly a problem for post-communist countries or the newer member states, and certainly in the Czech case, is that we don't really share the experience of Western Europe, where I think significant parts of the population do buy the European project as something that sort of has grown out of the experience of World War II, and so this is what guarantees. First of all, it guarantees peaceful coexistence, and it guarantees some level of individual rights protection as well. So get to the migration issue and a bit through that as a bit of a segue. But to quickly wrap up, is actually Czechs do, again, a significant section of the Czech population sees the EU as something that is supposed to be beneficial to us economically, and don't really want to get into, talk about European values because those parts of the population don't really understand the EU as the peace project. That's the additional layer, which is sort of, I guess, understood widely in Western European societies. In post-communist societies, it is much less reflected, I guess, that way. And it brings me quickly to the migration issue. This country has seen a terrible drop, I think, in the support for, well, has been always critical. Actually, I worked on migration policies some 15 years ago, wrote a paper on that. And at that point, we were looking at ways to actually how to help the Czech society accept migrants. And at that point, also the government actively looking at that issue. And what came out at that point from the public opinion polls was, again, showing transactionally the what people are interested in, actually, can we actually benefit from migration? So this was the point we were actually suggesting at that point the government should point out. But in recent years, I guess, with the disinformation going on heavily, and with the populism around migration, the Czech Republic's score in actually people willing to accept migrants has actually sadly decreased dramatically as well. So I think we're about as the Czech population is about as bad, if I put it simply, as the Polish or Hungarian population, and almost as awful in its policy. The government has been almost as awful, if not even more awful, in actual policies. Actually, how many refugees and migrants the country accepts.
Would you like to reflect?
Even if I think the question was not for me, but when you said, when you asked if it was based on pulse opinion or votes, I would say both. And as you know, both indicators have their plus and minus. When you ask question for pulse opinion, especially Eurobarometer, it's a bit artificial to answer because it comes from nowhere. And votes also, it's not precise because we don't vote only for European issues, but whatever. The Eurobarometer showed something quite paradoxically in Czech Republic. General population, I don't distinguish between age and gender and something. And they showed that more Czech would trust, they don't want more Europe. They're not so much enthusiastic when it comes to European policies and so on, but they trust more European institutions than their own Czech institutions. So they don't want to change their own institution. They don't trust them. They would like to maybe to change the European institution that trust them more than the Czech one, which is a bit interesting. And the second thing, Timothy Snyder. You probably read Timothy Snyder. Is one of the main American specialists of the history of Central Europe. He's worldwide known now, and he published this book, Les Terres de Sang.
Bloodlands.
Bloodlands, yes, Timothy Snyder. And he gave an interview, and someone asked him, the journalist asked him about the current situation in Czech Republic, and he said that in the 80s, 90s, till now, there was a kind of moral competition between the Václav Havel approach and Václav Klaus approach. And he said Václav Klaus approach won this competition because the current situation of the society resembles more to Václav Klaus than to Václav Havel. So when it comes to issue like migration can be seen as something positive in economic terms, and because politics is a tool for economic improvement. So it was, in a way, the idea of Václav Klaus. So it was, the incarnation of this pragmatic approach of politics. And Václav Havel was something completely different in terms of politics. It was presenting, in fact, it was identified to a way to do politics which is very moral, but not pragmatic at all. And these two tendencies coexist in the Czech society, and Snyder said one now is much more dominant than the other, and it is the Václav Klaus one.
I think it's also important to mention that this particular region have been a lot more xenophobic even before the migration influx started in 2015 than all the European countries in the West and in the North, which have actually had a tremendous amount of immigrants from different cultural backgrounds. So we are kind of like, we could say that we are homogeneous in this region. And despite the fact that we didn't really have to interact, or just because of that, the level of xenophobia was a lot higher. And what Mr. Orban did and Mr. Kaczynski did in the last couple of years left huge traces on the society. So the level of xenophobia is right now even higher than it was before because of, so it was like a vicious circle. Yeah, this negative, positive feeding of xenophobia, I would say. And that's how the society is, so to say, closing ranks behind this kind of approach of not wanting migrants in this region. That's what we Hungarian call the platonic xenophobia, that the society is very rejective towards migrants without having actually them in the country.
It refers to the Juif imaginaire.
Exactly.
And that if I can make some humor about these tragic things, but the Polish government, you don't accept that. Polish government tries hard to fight against his etiquette as an anti-Semitic country by being more xenophobic to Muslims.
Well, this is definitely an internal competition on their side, yes. I saw one more hand there, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, it's kind of like goes against what I believe or like this the question that I'm gonna make. I don't know how to feel about it, but it popped out in my mind. So we're kind of like here. We're just kind of like this association here.
Take up the mouse, please.
Okay.
Maybe.
Well, first, my name is Gustavo, and we're all here all together. And my question is, so it goes on the same way with Euroscepticism with different intention. So since we arrived here, Euroscepticism, even yesterday, we had kind of like a workshop against kind of like either populist or radical narratives. And Euroscepticism is always there. And I feel that it's something although it's temporary, it's kind of we have to learn how to deal with it because in Europe or Western, we're kind of like the dichotomy, we see AB and confrontation all the time. So I was wondering, since we have like both more either kind of like the practical politics, but at the same time the research part, it's kind of like a double question. The first one is this that from politics or within the practice of politics, have you seen there is a clear nexus or evidence between Euroscepticism that could definitely affect democratic resilience, Eurosceptic parties, or to put it the other way, if clearly pro-European parties give a clear effective governance, if there's like a clear nexus between this kind of relations that there's like the general narratives, and in the other way, maybe sometimes instead of confronting, we can try to include, we could say like the enemy or whatever you want to call it, and the delay, and from the cooperation and multilateral side, if there's like a point or some maybe negotiation parts that we can get into the multilateral European Union narrative from Eurosceptic parties or ideas that also cooperate with other countries, like for example Russia from China, that we can maybe get their external cooperation inputted into the European Union, kind of like from behind.
Gentlemen, who would like to start?
Well, if I can start, and if I understand, if I can sort of answer your question right, I think so the question basically was how do we fight Euroscepticism? How do we include Eurosceptic elements?
And I think also if whether Eurosceptic parties are threatening democratic framework per se by being Eurosceptic, right?
More or less,
So that's the. Yeah, I think this is a question to the political science.
Right. Let me quickly actually start by picking up what Jérôme was saying, and thank you for reminding us about the Eurobarometer showing sort of the higher trust in European institutions than in Czech institutions. And I'll try to, actually, I think it was a CVVM poll also a few years ago, one of the better polling agencies in this country, showing that it is actually the trust in institutions, whether in Czech institutions or in European institutions, are actually correlated. So actually, yeah, there are people who don't trust Czech institutions, but trust EU institutions, which sounds sorry?
I think it's more common.
Right, which I guess would be actually from the public discourse would be, you wouldn't actually expect that. But the key issue here I think is actually really that, both that maybe that way. I guess it shows that the Euroscepticism is actually a function of distrust in institutions in general, if you know what I mean. I think that this has to do partly what I was trying to say. I think I didn't put it too well in response to Anna's question, was that actually, yeah, we don't actually, in this country, we didn't respond to World War II by building institutions and the human rights, basically human rights safeguards for individuals and for the society to survive. But well, I guess what Edith had mentioned, yeah, we're homogeneous here, but we kicked out the Germans and the problem was gone, right? It wasn't, of course, it wasn't. Mm-hmm. We destroyed our own reasonably respectable First Republic's tradition of a protection of individual rights by getting rid of the Germans. We destroyed our own institutions at that point, and we didn't build anything new, and we just, partly elected and partly imported the communists, basically, right? And today, I think we're in a similar situation. I think the challenge, and this is I guess one of the reasons why I'm increasingly interested in actually serving in education myself, and actually, looking at both analytically and both practically at actually how, for example, civics is being taught at Czech secondary schools. I actually see that as the key place where actually we can make sure that at least in the future, not your generation, but actually younger kids actually can trust institutions in the long run, and can first of all understand how they work, and can trust them. You actually see that there's actually significant and potentially difficult future in that actually not enough young people are educated well in this country. I'm speaking about this country's experience specifically, in actually how both Czech institutions and EU institutions actually work. And so if I'm answering the question, I think it's actually my general answer would be both sort of in practical politics and in practical policies, to actually try to build up the trust in institutions, whether it's of national institutions or EU institutions, and obviously not to put them against each other. Although they're obviously, looking at practical politics, that's a very easy mobilization point for anyone to sort of go against one or the other institution.
I think you came up with a very important question: is what to do and how to communicate, and do we have to debate, and in fact, how to do we have to integrate the anti-Europe or Eurosceptic in the public debate? And I think as a researcher, for instance, I've been asked many times, can you explain us what happens in Poland and Hungary? Because most of people just simplificate and caricature what happens. And I think we have, as a researcher, to try to understand. For instance, to remember the terms of close offer about 1999. Close offer was a German researcher, very well known also, and he said there were triple transition in 1999: economic, political, but there was also the restoration of sovereignty. And we in the West, I mean, not we, but the politicians in the West just didn't really take in account that, and they didn't see how much the Europeanization could be perceived here as a threat, as something not really fitting in the idea of what is a nation. And of course, we have to be very conscious about that, because it's not only political instrumentalization by far-right individuals, by political entrepreneurs from the populist side. It's not only that. And if it works so long, like in Poland, it's also because it refers to local, national identities shared by a lot of people. But to understand doesn't mean to justify. And when it comes to political fight, I think it becomes more tricky, even impossible now, because everything is completely confused. For instance, it's fair not to be a European or not to support European Union. It's fair because it's a matter of public policy at first. It's a matter of strategy. It's not bad as such, of course, but it became that because now it's confused with a lot of anti-sentiments. And I think you said that before. If you are Eurosceptic, you are also against your own national institutions, against the politicians, against everything, but against migrants. So now it became something sometimes leftist, sometimes right, but commonly against almost everything. And the problem is now that the leaders of the different camps are completely not respecting the minimum rules of the debate, of rationality. I mean, Éric Zemmour in France, for instance, Éric Zemmour talks about history. He presents himself as someone knowing the history, the past of France, and every single word is a reconstruction of history. So, of course, you would say every history written by an historian is a reconstruction of the past, which is also true, but it's not the same kind of reconstruction because one is based on methodology, on reviewing by your colleagues, on bibliographia. It's a cumulative research, and the other one just come from his stupid mind, you know, and from far right references. The problem is that it's so powerful. Part of the society believes that what he says is the truth, you know. So.
Indeed. Shall we have one more hour? We could open up a symposium about conspiracy theories and all these issues, which is equally important, but unfortunately our time is up, so we have to leave it here. Gentlemen, thank you for the great insight. I think it was very eye-opening. You gave a tremendous amount of interesting data and insight. Thank you also for the great questions. Thanks for the organizers. Thank you all.
Thank you to you.